Okay, everybody. I'd like to start the webinar. We don't have too many participants today, as we had a little bit of a time mix-up, but we will have the recording for people for a month afterwards. If they write me, they can get the specific link. Um, so today's webinar is being given to us by Jacqueline Pye, who's with the Department of Educational Psychology and Pediatrics at the University of Alberta. And I actually heard her speak at a retreat we had for FASD mentors back, sometime last winter. I can't remember the exact month it was. And really thought that this would be a good fit for us with the Mental Health Network. So I'm very proud to bring her in and excited about Jackie's conversation with us and presentation about growth mindset and every child has potential. And Jackie, because we don't have as many participants um, as we go along, if I think of any, I'll throw out questions for you as well, or ways to kind of have a conversation, and we'll go from there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lee.
No problem.
Yeah, and as we discussed, and as you said so nicely in the introduction there, it's always a nice opportunity to have a conversation. And the more we can back and forth. And so if others join us, or if you have questions, or I see there's somebody else online, if there are questions and things that we want to turn this into more of a conversation than a one-way street, that's really nice to do. It allows me to sort of answer questions and make sure that I'm providing information that's useful, as opposed to just rattling away here, staring at my computer screen and wondering, if it's useful. So I would love any questions. Jump in at any point. Any need for kind of clarification, or just a thought. I will, on occasion, refer to my own examples or my own experiences. In addition to working at the university, I'm also a registered psychologist, so I sometimes like to think about my own experiences. I'm also a mother, which I think I use my motherhood more than my psychologyhood, so to speak, even more often. So tells you what really influences me. So I'll use those examples, but I really welcome and would appreciate hearing questions or thoughts from others as we really think about what it makes and what it means to make sense of children in a way that is really growth promoting. And that's what we're talking about. And I think that's this entire presentation is when we're working with complex and vulnerable children, or any children, but particularly with complex and vulnerable children, what does it mean to really adopt a perspective and a philosophy that is growth oriented, or thinking about how they can grow and develop, instead of being primarily focused on how do we manage the difficulties or the challenges. And that is a really difficult balance, particularly when we work in mental health, or fields where we're presented with children who come to us, or families who come to us, or support workers who come to us because they're feeling that they're struggling to understand or struggling to respond to needs that are usually problematic, and to incorporate into our response a perspective that allows us to think about the possibility and the growth of the child. It is sometimes hard, and how do we balance that? And so those might be conversations that we talk about a little bit. My goal today is to really focus on the growth side of things, and what that looks like and what that means. But it's not to say that we're not addressing challenges, but rather I'm focusing on this, saying this needs to be weighted as much and as heavily as any of our clinical wisdom that might be tapped or accessed as we're working with population. So as we go forward today, finding my arrows, there we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about individuality, how children are different. I'm going to talk about relationship, nurturing growth, kind of climate, and ultimately working together, which you guys are already doing. You're in a network, but I like to come back to that and think about that. you'll see that I'm talking about seeds and soil and things like that. And that's because today I decided that I would really embrace growth and use that as a real metaphor. And so I'm using growing and plants and flowers as a metaphor today to think about this idea and the concept. I love metaphors. I find that they give me a way of thinking about things. And as I sit here on this really gray and bland November day, I don't know what it's like for all of you over in Saskatchewan, but here in Edmonton, although we have a little bit of sun, it's that gray and ungrowing time of year. So I like any opportunity to look at something green. So that's our plan for today. And again, like I said, please jump in with questions, comments. I love any kind of feedback that allows me to make sure that I'm sharing information that is meaningful and relevant. So as we get started, the first component or the first piece I want to talk about is every seed is different. And again, this is applying a metaphor, but this is closely aligned with some of the theory that many of you may be familiar with in child development that talks about the uniqueness of every child that we interact with along a long, wide spectrum of what is typical, what is atypical, whatever. There's a long spectrum. And within that, all children are unique. All children come with unique areas of strength and difficulty. Within that understanding, there's been a lot of theories that have been identified that talk to us a little bit about how those differences between children also contribute to different levels of vulnerability or different susceptibilities. Children are born, in some cases, so those seeds, before we even get near them, are introduced to the world with different levels of vulnerability and tolerance. And I compare that to flowers. And this is a metaphor that's been used long before me. And others have talked about the difference between things like dandelion and orchid children. And the difference in the metaphor that's used is to speak to the fact that from the very seed, even before environmental interactions occurred, children are born with a different ability to manage stress or difference or adversity in their environments. I've shifted the metaphor a little bit today to be orchids and marigolds, in part because marigold is my favorite flower in the whole world. So I love to talk about marigolds. But in keeping with that theory, a marigold is a very tenacious flower, and it can grow in many different climates and many different soils. And it can be quite protective of other flowers, in fact. And if you have problems with things like aphids, you're going to want to plant a marigold because they actually help to protect other plants. Orchids, on the other hand, are much more vulnerable to environmental condition. Orchids are really sensitive to changes in light, changes in temperature, soil differences, and their growth will be affected much more significantly by those differences. Our children are the same. Some children are grown where they when some children are born, they seem to tolerate significant amounts of adversity and difference really well and navigate challenges in ways that surprise us. Other children struggle more and have greater difficulty navigating those stresses and making sense of differences that they experience in the world. These differences in vulnerabilities or these differences in children don't set their value, and they aren't good or bad. I mean, the flowers are beautiful. All flowers have something to offer. So it is not a value difference, but simply a susceptibility difference. And it tells us that we need to be sensitive to the unique differences. Each child has unique areas of strength and difficulty. All children do. But these unique differences or these unique aspects of each child create differences in the way in which they respond to their environment. Consequently, we really need to be able to sit and think, what are the needs of each child? What does this child require in order to function effectively within a given environment? The exciting part of this story, and the thing that I think increasingly in research that we're beginning to understand, is that all children, just like all flowers, can thrive when under the right conditions. And yet the environmental differences or the impact of environment is far greater on our orchid children, on those children that have that greater vulnerability, and that impact or that difference impact is pronounced in both directions, meaning a poor environment is going to have a greater negative impact, but in the same kind of flip side of things, a positive environment is going to have a much greater positive impact. So the power or the potential of environment is so much greater when we are working with our orchid children, or those children that are more vulnerable or more susceptible or more influenced by environment. And so goodness of fit is really critical for this group. And this is often the group that we'll see in clinical settings, are these groups that are much more sensitized and much more vulnerable to the impact of their environment. And the more that we've learned and the more that we've discovered around environmental susceptibilities or developmental susceptibility type theories, is that these differences in susceptibility or the sensitivity to environment is not necessarily predictive of outcome, meaning that if we can find the right fitting environment, we can see fantastic things. That flower, just like an orchid, can bloom and be beautiful and contribute and have so much to offer. But we need to understand the unique needs of that child. And we have to understand that the needs of that child are going to be different than other children's needs. And if we try to do a one size fits all, we're going to run into difficulty. I suspect those of you working in mental health, this is not a new message at all, but I think it's a really important starting point, because it allows us to characterize the differences in children as not value laden or good and bad, but rather looking at the goodness of fit between child and environment. And if we're recognizing that it's about goodness of fit, then we can start to say, rather than saying, how do we reduce the problems or how do we address the challenges, we can start to say, what would be the conditions that would support growth for this particular individual? So what would success look like? So instead of saying, what are the problems for an orchid, we start to say, well, what kind of soil is conducive to healthy growth? What kind of environment, what kind of lighting do they need? And we start to do things to uniquely adapt the environment. And that's part of what we're going to start talking about. I see there's a few other folks that are joining us, and that's wonderful. And welcome to everybody who's here. And as Lee has just made a note on the chat, I really welcome questions at any point. I love the opportunity to have more of a conversation with you guys than just sort of keep meandering through. Otherwise, you're going to get kind of my stream of consciousness that will be somewhat organized by the slides. But I really love the opportunity that if something pops into your mind or you go, well, hang on a minute, what about? Please, throw in a comment or ask a question. It just might make it more engaging for everyone. So always welcome. So we start with that. What is our seed? Each child is unique. Everybody has unique needs, and identifying those needs allows us to help create an environment that is growth facilitative, that promotes or creates the potential for growth. It requires that philosophy, that perspective of what does growth look like. So when we're looking at growth and creating a growth facilitative or growth promoting environment, the first place we start when we're a planter or a gardener is with the soil. And we think, well, how do we prepare the soil? And what are the conditions within which we set that seed? Where do we put that child? What is that child surrounded by? And this is where a lot of our attachment and relationship literature really rises in and becomes really important for us. We know that relationships are foundational to development, and relationships of many shapes and forms, sizes, etc., create the conditions for early development, early childhood development, and lifelong development, as a matter of fact. And attachment can change and evolve and grow. Those healthy relationships are what create at a brain-based level and all the way through to sort of a behavioral, developmental, interactive level, the conditions where we start to interact with the world and determine in what way we're going to get our needs met. So relationships, particularly for early childhood and young children, are that soil and are that place that we're looking for, that surrounds us, encloses us, provides us with that comfort, but is really where we're saying, how are my needs going to be met, and how can I be comfortable in that? Attachment, in particular, provides us warmth and safety. Attachment allows us to trust and feel safe reaching out into the world. Again, early childhood mental health providers, I suspect that attachment theories and a lot of the literature that goes along with that are probably familiar to you in some way, shape, or form. And I think that it is that attachment literature that, particularly now, is really opening the door for the possibility of the relationship. And I think sometimes it's the most exciting literature for me as a professional, because it really underscores how much we matter. And not just because of what we do, or what treatment do I do, or what approach do I use, or what management technique, or all of these kind of troubleshooting things, but rather from a strength-based or a growth lens. Simply me being there and being connected to somebody actually really matters. And through the lifespan, increasingly, we're discovering that relationship, and that particular, that warmth and that safety component, can be one of the biggest catalysts for any kind of growth out of anything else we do. It's really interesting. I teach a lot to psychologists who are learning and developing their skills as psychologists. And they're always asking me, well, what treatment do I use when? And they say, should I use, a cognitive behavior approach, or should I be using some kind of behavior management strategy? They're very interested in what toolbox they should pull out of, and what technique and what approach really matters. And when they do, I say, let's look at the research, let's look at the literature, and what we find is that all of those approaches can have success, and they can describe all of these lovely outcomes, but at the end of the day, the component for all of these approaches, that it's often the biggest indicator of the extent to which something is going to be successful, is the strength of the relationship that exists. In some literature, we talk about things like working alliance, particularly as people get older, or we may use rapport or language around those kind of pieces to define it. But that component of relationship is fundamental, and that relationship can be relationship with the child, that relationship can be relationship with the caregivers. And in all capacities, it is the strength of the relationship that seems to predict the extent to which our approaches promote growth and create the conditions for something, for us to best meet the needs of an individual, so that they can actually experience success at the end of the day. In keeping with that attachment component, important pieces to our relationships include consistency, which means that as we do things, that we're doing things similarly, and that we're talking and having these kinds of webinars and a network like you guys have is outstanding and exciting to me, that you've created that many opportunities for talk, because the more we talk, the more consistent we can be. And we know how important that is for children. When a world is not consistent, it's not predictable. Similarly, stability. Same person over time. As much as we can have the same person or have systematic stability, this becomes really important when we're looking at things like transitioning from preschool to regular school, kindergarten to grade 1, or preschool to kindergarten, depending on where your transitions are. Where is our stability components, and what is continued through in terms of people? Not just techniques and strategies, but where are the people stability components, and ways in which we engage and listen to children. So again, environment and environment goodness of fit is in part determined by us just paying attention to the cues. So if we go back and look at our seed, we can look at our seed in the soil. And if that seed is not at all sprouting in any way, shape, or form, then we're going to start to say, well, maybe there's something about the pH value in my soil. Maybe I'm watering too much. Maybe I'm not watering enough. Maybe there's too much heat. Maybe there's too little heat. We ask all of these questions. When we work with children, the lovely thing is they can do what plants can't do for us. they can talk to us, and they can be components that help us to build a relationship and to identify those environmental components that we could shift potentially in order to create that growth nurturing environment. Children are really powerful contributors, and how we engage them and how we talk to them, of course, depends on their age and their abilities to communicate. But there's lots of ways to listen to children, and children really can be surprisingly insightful in terms of what they need. That's why they're so good at getting needs met, even when their approach to getting their needs met is perhaps not what we would select because it may be disruptive to us. One of the questions I ask when I'm thinking about this, relationships are foundational, and I think in my practice and in my work, and I ask, and I think is sort of a take home for you guys in your work, or something that I would encourage and always encourage my students is, what are the signs that a child is engaged, number one, and two, relatedly, that the environment is facilitating a growth relationship? And asking yourself, what do you look for? What do you look for to say, is the environment that we've created actually facilitating growth? Oftentimes we'll say, well, I look for the signs that, they're not disruptive. And I'm like, well, that's not a growth indicator. That's sort of a problem mitigation focus. What would be a growth indicator? What would be a sign that the environment is facilitating growth? The fact that Johnny actually, offered a toy to somebody instead of taking it away, or the fact that Johnny sat in his seat for 5 minutes instead of 4 minutes, or 5 seconds instead of 4 seconds, or whatever that improvement or that growth or that positive attainment might look like. What would we look for? How would we know? And how do we know that that child is engaged? What tells us? Are they looking to us? Are they coming to us? Are they approaching us more readily? What would we look for to see that? And to embed that in some of our questioning, and to become vigilant to those pieces of engagement and growth. What are we looking for? What would be the signs? Just like if you're growing a flower, you might be watching that soil to watch for that tiny bit of sprout. What would be that tiny sprout? And we're not necessarily looking for the flower. We're not worried about whether or not we see that orchid blooming yet. What we're looking for is just a tiny little peak of green that's coming through. And we're like, woohoo, there's the green. Yeah, let's look for the green. And so how are we doing that in our environments? How are we doing that within our relationships and seeking that? No questions? Everybody still, we're ticking along okay? I'm guessing so. I'm nodding at my own computer. I don't know what that means, but it's always so strange to talk to a computer when you're used to talking to people. It feels very slightly detached. So like I say, feel free to ask some questions. The next piece I want to talk about is how we nurture growth. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things, control and expectation. And these are two pieces of information, or two kind of content pieces that come out of a sort of school of psychological thought called the psychology of growth. And there's a big body of literature around the psychology of growth and what it means to support healthy growth and development. And it's interesting to me that the conversation we're having today is we're thinking about growth and what it means to promote growth in children, in all children. This is a conversation that for typically developing kids is very common, and it's actually a very well-established literature-based, theory-based, empirical data, all of these things. But it's not extended very well to clinical populations. In clinical populations, we tend to talk a lot about what is the problem, what is the deficit, what is the treatment, what do we do to get rid of the problem. And so what we've been trying to do here, and you may have noticed on my first slide, I acknowledged a colleague of mine, Dr. Leah Daniels, but some of the work that we've been doing here is saying, what can we do to better balance the literature between these two places? So much like I said at the beginning of my presentation, how do we not ignore the challenges or the clinical needs or issues, but balance that with some of the wisdom that we're gaining from the field of growth psychology in order to say what are components that we need present, because we need to be saying, how do we help kids grow? Not just how do we address the problems? What does growth look like? And if we're talking about some of our unique children who might have more environmental vulnerabilities, our orchid kids, what are we doing to promote growth for our orchids? I'm getting tongue tied. So two areas that that field of growth psychology talks about is the importance of control and the importance of expectation. So I just want to unpack those a little bit to say, what are we talking about with those two components that allow us to nurture and promote growth? Power of control. And control really relates to the idea of choice and how important choice is for all of us as human beings. We all need to feel that we have some kind of autonomy and some ability to control or impact the environment around us, particularly as we get older and older and older. This starts when we're very young, and is very early. And any of you who work with or have raised a 2-year-old are very familiar with the lovely no stage. And that no stage is that real early beginnings of that autonomy. Wait a minute, I want to control my world a little bit. I don't want everybody else deciding for me. And the older we get, the more important that becomes. And equipping people to be autonomous begins in those preschool years. And saying, well, what does it mean to make choices that are healthy, that are safe, that work through that process of choice making, so that one day when you're 18 plus, you're able to go on and have that actual legal autonomy that is given to you in a meaningful way. So choice is not just randomly choose anything, do whatever you want. It's choice with a structure. So how do we create structure? How do we think about what is a healthy choice? So at this point, I will, throw my poor son out and use him as an example. When my son was young, probably in that 2 to 3-year-old age, he really did not like to wear pants. He's a young little guy and he liked everything to be free. Now I live in Edmonton, as I already said to you, and like I'm sure in Saskatchewan, it gets pretty cold here in the winter. And so going out to the Safeway to get groceries in the middle of, minus 30 below with my son with no pants was a safety issue. So I needed to put pants on him. However, any of you who have been in this situation know that when you try to put pants on a 2-year-old child, guess who wins every time? Those 2-year-olds, they really move and they really work. And so it became a real challenge, and it became a real difficult situation. And so one of my colleagues actually said to me, Jackie, why don't you start practicing what you preach? To which I said, what? And they said, give him a choice, give your son a choice. And so from there I said, okay, well, what would choice with structure mean? I can't say, do you want to wear pants or not? Because it's not safe. However, what I can say is pick whatever pants you want. So in the morning, instead of saying, Nathan, put your pants on, I changed this to, Nathan, find some pants to wear. What do you want to wear? What would you like to? And allow him to pick whatever he wants. Which meant that when he picked up the lime green glow in the dark pants to wear, I had to say, those look fantastic, away we go. And make, have no complaint or no argument. But really, doesn't matter. He made a choice. He's wearing pants. He's safe. I'm reading Lee's comment while I'm talking, which is awesome. Lee, I love the question. Providing choice is something that sometimes people in very structured programs have problems balancing. For sure. Absolutely. So, well, how do we build some control into? I think even in very structured programming, kind of like my pants example, there are things that we say we cannot change this or that, but what choices can we create within the structure? So if we're in a really structured program, gosh, I'm just trying, somebody's going to help me with an example. I see somebody else is typing, which is really great, which means it's going to help me out. Sometimes it's not a choice. The choice does not necessarily be to whether or not I engage or whether or not I complete a task, but how I do it or what I might choose to do it with. I worked with an educator at one point with a really young kiddo in the class, and she was quite agitated about the fact that he always put his shoes on backwards. puts one on his right shoe on the left foot, and etc. The other way. And I said, well, what's wrong with that? And she's like, well, the shoes are on the wrong foot. He needs to learn to put them on the right foot. And I said, well, why? Why do we need that? He's wearing shoes. He's safe. If he's functioning, he can walk. He can get where he needs to get. That's a choice he's making. He doesn't have a choice whether or not to wear his shoes, but he does have a choice as to which foot to put it on. And I think that if we start to be creative and we sit around the room and we say, here's our structured program, these are the things that we absolutely can't change because this is our actual core programmatic components. But can we give them a choice between this? If they're using paper for this, can they pick their color of paper? How much choice can we give them? How much choice can we give them around, whether they use a pen or a pencil? How much choice can we give them around, any of the components that might fit within that structure? I'm hoping that kind of gives you some examples, but I'm going to watch for more questions where people say, okay, well, here, oh, hang on, there we go. I see, is that Angel, I think? Yes, great choices for a 2-year-old. 9 months, and he loves to look at pictures on the clothing. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they really understand at a young age, don't they? It's amazing Yeah, I'll tell you, Angel, back to my son with the parents. When I went to the Safeway and he had his lime green pants on, and I think he also selected a very vibrant red shirt. It was his color stage. And I walked through, and there were a lot of people that had a look, and a lot of them sort of said things like, oh, wow, oh, look at what your child's wearing. But I mean, he was proud as punch that he'd selected that outfit, and I said, that's outstanding. And maybe as he gets older, he'll, make different choices around his clothes, but he was very proud. And some of those two other pieces I have there around control, that autonomy and that individuality, were really expressed. And whether you're 2 or you're 22, the types of choices and the extent of choices, they're sure going to change. And how much we can structure and create safety in those choices is really, really going to change. But what is not going to change is the feeling of autonomy that people get when they get to make their own choice, and the individuality, the realization that I can do things a little bit different and still fit within a structure. And somebody has mentioned snack choices, activity choices. Fantastic. If you're doing an activity where you're at a gym or you're doing something where you're doing stretch movements, saying, okay, we're all going to stretch. Everybody pick their own stretch. Here's 3 choices, or here's some ideas. And if one child wants to do, a really different kind of stretch, and you're like, gosh, I've never seen anything quite like that, so be it. They're still stretching. And so I think Angel also said something about taking the time to do things and not rushing. I think sometimes when it comes to control, when we break it down, we all go, yeah, we like control. Yeah, we can figure out what structured choices look like. But it does mean at times that we have to kind of problem solve and think it through, and it does take more time. And we also have to say, okay, when do we have time to create room for choice, and when don't we? And that's okay too. It's not going to work everywhere. There are days that you just don't have time for it. But I think it's having an intentional room and space for that control, and for the place where somebody can feel like I can make choice, I have control over my environment, and there's power in that, and I can express my individuality that way, and I can feel competency, and I can feel autonomy, and I feel like I've got some strengths. And I think and then we've got lots of literature that really speaks to how important that is for having a person begin to develop not only that safe decision-making skill, but also that sense of self and that sense of competency. And if you don't make time, the tantrums come. Isn't it true? When we talk about engaging kids, when I talked about relationships earlier, Angel, you know, uh, how we engage kids is so important, how we listen to them, because when we don't take the time to engage and listen to kids, they will express themselves however they need to, because they're getting needs met. And so oftentimes tantrums and things are getting thrown. Those are expressions, those are communications. They're engaging us. We may not love that approach to engagement, but a tantrum is really expressive, and it's often a way where we're getting a fairly clear communication. Um, my question for you on this slide is, what is a safe choice? What does that mean? How will I know it's nurtured growth? So my challenge on this particular idea is to say, create intention in your choice making space, and then look at it as a growth nurturing. So identify those small choices, and when somebody makes a choice, and when there's a choice made, they've made a snack choice or they've made an activity choice, that's growth. That's a positive, that is a strength that they're exhibiting. And acknowledging their choice, recognizing their choice. Sometimes, if we, depending on their age and their ability to communicate, asking them a little bit about how they made their choice, and noting that those can be really powerful approaches to acknowledging where that growth is and creating the conditions for more growth, future growth, by understanding how they're making a choice, how they're getting there, what's their logic, what's their process. Raising expectations. This is the second piece, and this one is often one where folks, we get nervous because we start talking about expectations and we're really worried about expectations that are too high and children that are frustrated and overwhelmed and feeling that they can't make it in their environment. And because of that, we're often quite protective and we look out for kids. And well, we should. We're trying to protect, we're trying to look after kids. But sometimes we go too far with that, and we have too much bubble wrap and not enough expectation. And finding this middle ground, so much of it is a negotiation. I wish life was toolboxes in black and white, but it's not. And it's a really reasonable conversation to have on our radar. And something that we want to put there is, what does it mean to set expectations for a child, and expectations that are growth oriented? So how do we raise the bar? How do we look forward for a child? How do we say, not just how do you stop doing these things, but rather, how are we going to help you start achieving some goals? How are we going to help you grow this skill? How are we going to help you get better at these things? And we're going to set the bar a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put support in place. And we're going to say, what would it mean to support you towards that expectation? And how do we manage those supports in a way that allows you the space to reach forward, to reach up, to grow, to stretch a little bit, but to feel safe in that stretch? That's that nuanced space. That's that place where we're sometimes negotiating and navigating. That's why that foundation, that soil of relationship is critical, because when we have a relationship that is safe and trusting, then even when a child's stretching, they have a safety net, they have a safety in there, and that trust is present. And sometimes that safety net's going to be really close and a little bit more structured, and other times we're going to step back a little bit and allow a little bit more space. Creating spaces where we let kids know that it's safe to fail. It's safe to make a mess. It's safe to have a mistake. It's safe to even have a temper tantrum. But here are the safety limits that we're going to set around that, and how we're going to keep you safe and keep you protected as you're learning what it means to stretch and to grow, and how we're going to keep moving forward. And so expectations are one of those things that we want to really look at how we match those, how we create the conditions that make sense for a child, how we find that goodness of fit. All of that's important. I've made a note on my slide that we don't expect an orchid to grow like a marigold. There's going to be differences and they're going to be unique, but we expect both of them to grow. They're both going to grow, and given the right nurturing and the right conditions, both of those can grow. So what does it mean for them to grow? How do we set those expectations? How do we say, where do we want to go? And create that for the child and allow them to go through that process. I see you're typing there, Lee, so I'll wait a minute before we go on. One of the things educators say often, and if there's any educators that are in here participating, this may be familiar, but they talk about the word fail, and they talk about how afraid we are of failure, and that we've kind of equated that with sort of a value judgment, like a bad thing. When in fact they break it down into an acronym, and they talk about first attempt in learning, and recharacterizing the word failure as actually a really fantastic thing. Because if you failed at something, it means you tried at something. How awesome is that? That's a growth perspective and that's a shift. And if you failed, then we can look at it and we can say, okay, let's understand this. And maybe we have to shift our expectation a bit. Maybe we have to shift our strategy a bit. Maybe we have to change our support a little bit. But um, this creates those conditions that allow you to stretch. Sorry, I was reading while I was talking. I should know better than to try to multitasking. Can you please talk about what happens when you don't have expectations? Their parents are told their child to have limitations, don't expect anything more than this. Oh gosh. Sometimes I think we try to be protective and we say things like, don't expect your child to do more than this. And we set these ceilings. And I think that the intention is to be protective and to say, we don't want you to be disappointed or we don't want people to be upset. And we're trying to be protective and we're trying to say things like, um, we don't want to set kids up for failure. And again, using this value characterization, which is part of that kind of negative that we've attached to it. However, when we don't set expectations for children, or when we don't set that bar a little higher, the message we're giving our children is we don't believe you're capable of getting there. We don't think you can grow. We don't believe in you. There's been a lot of research done around expectation that is really interesting. I'll tell you about one study, and this kind of maybe illustrates this question that Lee's asking. They had a group of kids, all of whom, a large group of kids. This was done in a school setting, and some of this comes out of school kind of research, but has since been extended to lots of different questions. But this one study was really nicely done, so it's easy to talk about. They took a large group of kids and tested them all in terms of their math capacities and said, how good are you at math? And they selected from this large group a group of kids who all performed within an average range on a math test. So they were all able to do math typical for their age, all average, all right in the middle of average, in fact, and they kept them kind of close. Then they divided these kids randomly into two groups who they then randomly put back into their classes. And based on their random assignment, they told the educators either that the child was below average in math, so they don't do very good at math, so they're going to need help. Don't set those expectations too high. Or they told the teachers that this person is really good in math and they're going to go someplace. So make sure that you support them accordingly. Those were the two messages that were given to the educators from these randomly assigned group of kids, all of whom had exactly the same average skills. After several months, they went back and they tested these kids and said, where's your math at now? What they found was striking and was one of the strongest research findings that they've had. And that was that those kids whose teachers had been told they struggled in math all performed lower than they had at the first time point. Many of them dropped down to low average or lower abilities in math. So their performance dropped significantly. Those educators who had been told that the kids did well in math, their performance on the same test, same thing, went into an above average or high average range. They all improved in their math capacity. So the expectation that the teacher held actually changed the performance ability of the children. Why? Were they given different tasks? Were they given all of these things? There are multiple reasons that have been unpacked since then. But one of the strongest reasons that has come through all of the literature is that the belief the teacher had was imparted or impacted that child and their own expectation for themselves and their own ability to persist and to try at the task. Sorry, I thought I had another, but so I'm going back and forth here. They've done, even with expectations, I can get really excited about this stuff. And I didn't know if I had the slide in here, but if you want more information, I'm happy to provide it. So folks can email me after. I'll have my email address up later. But since then, they've done lots of studies. They've done medical studies, mental health studies, all sorts of things to look at the power of expectation in terms of shifting outcomes for individuals. And they've found things like even around medical treatments that have said that if you expect something to succeed, the likelihood of its success is significant. Any of you know, even drug trials, right? Any drug trials, any good drug trial requires there to be somebody who doesn't get the drug, somebody who does get the drug, and then somebody else who gets a placebo drug, because they've learned that just taking a drug and believing that this might make you better can make you better. So those of you who are familiar with things like placebo effects, that's expectations. What we believe to be true actually changes the way we see ourselves, how we perform, how we apply effort, how we motivate. So what are expectations? That's my ask for all of you. And how are we setting expectations that equip our kids with the opportunity to stretch a little bit, that say to our kids, I believe in you. I believe you can grow. How you're going to grow, how much you're going to grow, I don't know. We're going to figure that out as we go, right? We're going to see how you start to bloom and how things go. And if we start to see that maybe you're not growing as well, we're going to make some changes. But I believe you can grow. That has profound outcomes for our kids and can begin to shift the conversations we have. And suddenly we're not talking about what they can't do anymore. We're starting to talk about what they can do. Powerful for little kids to grow up with. Children learn differently. Hands-on, absolutely. Kids can be very hands-on. They can apply. Oh yeah, seeing props. As you say that, I'm like, oh gosh, right? So now all of a sudden we could build these visuals or create, like thermometers in a room that allow them to start to see how they're growing or something like that, right? Would that be great? Even setting goals for kids that allow them to see that. And we do sometimes that around behavior modification approaches. However, so often behavior modification is about reducing a behavior. So every time you don't do this, or if you have a day when this does not happen, as opposed to growth promoting, where we're saying, no, what are we going to do to get to this? How is that going to look? And to make it all about not what you're not doing, but what you can do, what we want you to do, what we want to support you in, which changes the entire story for our kiddos. Yes, being resilient is reaching out, taking advantages of new opportunities as skills. Absolutely. It's never too late. Resiliency is all about building our protective factors. And it's never too late. And in the brain literature, the work that I do when I do work with brains, we know that it is never too late to grow and change. Brains are plastic, they change, they evolve. What we do doesn't just change behavior patterns that we see or how somebody believes in themselves, but we actually change the structure of brain. All the way back to that soil that we're planting and that relationship. Healthy relationships change brain structure. Growth, psychology, this expectation that you can grow, the creation of safety around how you have some control and autonomy in your world, all of these impact the way in which a brain grows and it develops and create conditions for future growth and future development. In all children, it's going to look different. We can't say, I expect everybody to look like a marigold. No, some of our kids are going to look like orchids. So we got to adapt. What are those expectations? Let's adapt how we provide conditions for control. But adapting doesn't mean don't do it. Adapting means doing it in a way that suits that particular child, that flower, right? If you're a gardener, you know that the way you tend to different flowers is different. So it goes with children as well. And sometimes it takes longer for us to identify what are the unique needs of our flowers. Sometimes you're just given a seed and you have no idea what kind of flower that's going to grow into. Fine. So you watch, you pay attention, and you ask yourself, what are the signs that we're seeing growth? And if we're not, then what might we change towards growth? What we're kind of talking about here really is about creating a growth climate. And that's kind of foundational to all of this conversation, because if we don't have the right climate, if we don't come with the right philosophy or belief system to begin with, then the best soil in the world, the best nurturance and your watering and your shining sun, all of these things is not going to help if it's minus 30 degrees outside. When we create that deep freeze scenario or a fixed perspective that kids cannot change, or like Lee, like you said earlier, that you're being told that these are the limitations, this is it, this is permanent, this is unchanging, this is the way it is. What we're looking at is a frozen climate. Things don't grow in that. There's no ability to grow. In contrast, when we start saying what can change, what can grow, what's possible, then we're creating a warm climate. We're creating the kind of climate that facilitates growth and creates the conditions. These are basic beliefs and value systems. These are often referred to in the literature as mindsets. And we're talking about the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset. And a climate, where a mindset like a climate is something that surrounds everything. It's infused in all aspects of what we do. It's not just an action we take or a word we say, but it's a fundamental belief system that we have. It's what we believe to be true, because it is those beliefs that actually translate into all of our actions, and we act according to what we believe. And so if we truly believe that we can all grow in some way, shape, or form, in some way unique to who we are and what our characteristics are, then that will be infused in everything we do. And we will be constantly looking for growth in others. We'll seek what are the approaches to foster that growth. We won't be saying, what are signs, what are the problems? We're going to be saying, or at least we'll balance, we're going to be saying, let's talk about the growth. What can we do to nurture growth? We'll be focused on those nurturing conditions, or at least balancing it. If you're growing your garden, it doesn't mean you're not paying attention to the weeds, but it means that you're really focused not only on those weeds, but also on what you can do to nurture the growth. You balance it at the very least. And things can grow really, really well, even with a lot of weeds, if you've done a really good job of nurturing them. So it's not just about removing a problem, it's about creating growth. And the stronger your plant gets and the more it grows, the stronger your child gets and the more they grow, the more they'll be weed resistant, and more those difficulties, even when they are around there, they're going to be able to sustain or tolerate those a little bit more, particularly when we support them. A fixed mindset essentially is where we, someplace in us, believe that failure is about inability. If I fail, it means I can't do it. The more I work at it, it's not going to make any difference. I just can't do it. I'll give up. I can't tell you how many times I hear that in the kids I work with. I suspect that may be the same for some of you. You may have heard those comments before. I typically work with teens, although I have worked with young children in the past, that the teens, by the time they get to me, they'll often talk about 14 years of hearing that they can't do it and that they have a problem and that there's no point anyway. And just, all you need is an external brain. They've heard those kind of comments. And I'm like, but wait a minute, don't you have your own brain? And they go like, no, I don't have my own brain because I have an external one. Mine doesn't matter. And I'm like, whoa. And those might be really, really well-intentioned things where we're trying to support and take care of kids. But sometimes in those support, we forget that we actually take away part of what they need to be human. It's interesting to me, in the last few years, decades even, we've moved towards language that's very person-centered. And we've said, we don't say that a child is this, a child, we don't say something like an autistic child or an FASD child or something like that. Instead, we put the child first and we say a child with this. And the reason we do person first or person-centered language is because we believe that a child is more than just their disability or more than just the difficulty they may be experiencing. So we've shifted our language and we've said, this is really important language shift. But I don't know that we've changed our beliefs or our mindsets in the same way yet. So sometimes our language says the child comes first, but sometimes our practice is focused on the problem or the disability. We forget that there's a huge body of literature that says, what does it mean to grow children? What does it mean to help facilitate development in children? Well, it means to find stability and control. It means to set expectations. It means that relationships that are consistent and stable are critical. All of those are growth psychology and growth philosophies that are set in our beliefs. that sometimes get a little bit lost when we're confronted with big challenges. And it's easy to shift, and suddenly we forget that no, we're talking about children, and children can grow. And it is totally an area we can really model with children. I agree, Lee. Um, we can demonstrate that, oh gosh, I didn't do this, and it doesn't mean that I can't do it. It just means that maybe I need to find another way. Maybe I need to get another person to do it with me. Maybe I gotta, what would it look like? I won't give up. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to go back to it. I may have to shift my approach. I may need to ask for help in my approach. I may need to all of these other things. And yeah, we can model that. And we can demonstrate that. And when we make a mistake, when you're cooking your meal and you burns on the stove and you're like, ah, we have a choice there. And all of a sudden we can say to the kids who are watching so carefully, because boy, those guys sink everything in there, right? They're little sponges. They're watching us. We can say, gosh, wow, wonder what I can learn from this. Boy, I'm going to take this on. What a great learning chance this was. I don't like that now we don't have any food yet. We're going to have to go back to the fridge and get something new. But we learned something really important. We can turn our frustration with ourselves into those opportunities to model that for kids. And I think that part of that means that if we really adopt a mindset of growth, then we also have to look in the mirror and have that same mindset. So it means, as a parent, for example, there are days when I look in the mirror and I go, gosh, I did not handle that situation very well. I got angry, I yelled, and wow, that was not the mother of the moment. A mother of the day moment or something like that. But you know what? I learned something. I learned that, I was pushed past my tolerance point. I was learned that, gosh, maybe I should have made a little bit more time to get some food in my body today because I do not do this well when I haven't eaten. We can apply this growth mindset to us, not just in how we parent or support kids or look after folks, but even how we look in the mirror and take care of ourselves. Because if we truly have this mindset, then we're going to also see our own days that go kind of south as opportunities for us just to be better. And then we can start to live that, and we can be gentle with ourselves just as we're gentle with everybody else. These are learning opportunities. They're not failures. These are communication opportunities, growth opportunities, where they're failures in the different sense of the word. I keep grappling with how to use that word because it's used in so many different ways and it's so value laden that I struggle with using it. So that is mindsets. When we have a growth mindset, when we adopt this perspective, this belief system, this climate that embraces everything around us and our children, we become much more effective at overcoming obstacles. We increase our effort. We set higher expectations for ourselves and for others. We become much more effective at confronting challenges, more persistent. We're willing to keep trying. We're motivated. We actually are willing to give it another go, and we feel that we are capable of doing it. These are some of the outcomes of growth mindset that have been measured. It's really an interesting body of research that if any of you are interested in hearing more about, there are questionnaires and things that have been used where what they do is they look at large groups of individuals and they measure what is your belief system, and then they look at the extent to which that impacts treatment outcomes or success in different endeavors or different programs. And consistently, these are the findings. In one study that we've recently been doing, actually, we did an intervention study, self-regulation intervention study specific to individuals with FASD. So it's a fairly specific group, but still something that kind of fits in this because what we looked at is mindset within the study. So we looked at those individuals, those youth who did really well and responded well, and we looked at their mindset and the mindset that their caregivers had. And we found that there was greater success within the intervention, particularly around their ability to generate strategies for themselves when there was more of a growth mindset. So the more evidence of a growth mindset, the more effective these kids were at generating and creating strategies and believing that they can have a strategy that could have a difference. and even their ability to implement. So they're implementing more strategies at home and in other places, and demonstrating an increased effort and persistence to do this. Really exciting. This is an area that we continue to do work in so that we can better understand what it means to really shift our perspective and start asking the same things we've always asked. But what would it mean to ask that question from a growth perspective as opposed to a deficit perspective? Oh, yeah, great. Self-regulation is so fantastic. There's so many great opportunities for it. Self-regulation, gosh, you guys, self-regulation, if you're doing anything on it, it's such an awesome opportunity to work from a growth mindset because it's so strategy based and you can really think about what your growth possibilities are. We all need to kind of regulate. So it's not a unique, it's not a clinical approach. It's something we all have to learn. And in fact, any of you, if you do any kind of regulation, self-regulation work with kids, you may find your own regulatory skills get better. It's a great modeling opportunity if you do it together, like if you're doing it with a child, your own child or something like that, to for you both to be building your own strategies so that you can be modeling it and co-developing them. No matter how young your kids are, that can work really well. They can be really good. You can have all these visuals like Angel's talking about around your house, and then if you're doing it as well, then your child can get really good at pointing out how well you're doing. So, oh, good, good job using your regulation strategy. If you can get children watching you for it, and checking you and picking up on when you're using a strategy well, they're going to get better at seeing their own strategy use. And it becomes, a very strength-based approach. Yeah, self-regulation stuff is a great opportunity to really work from this climate and nurture growth in these ways. A last few notes I want to say just briefly and just things to kind of focus on in terms of how we enact this growth mindset. Is coming back to relationship again, gardening together. Feel free to keep throwing questions around it, but I just want to say a couple of quick things and then we'll open it up just for general questions and wrap up. But relationship in terms of a relationship with children is really important, but it's also important that we have relationship together. Back to what I was saying about working together and the real value of your network and how fantastic is it. Oh, Angel, I like your repetition and patience as well for water. I agree. I think that wouldn't it be a great visual? I'm still thinking about Angel's visuals here, so that's awesome. If you want to really work from growth, is to work with a child, create a plant, and start thinking about what are the things that they need, and get them help identifying. And you can, put words on a watering can, or you can visualize this to keep everybody focused on. This is about growing, not about managing problems. Um, the stronger we grow, the problems tend to help resolve a little bit too. Oh, thanks, Merle. I'm glad it's useful. Like I said, feel free to track me down for more. But let me come back to the team. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. This is you guys as a group. This is your webinars. This is your opportunity to have conversation. This is how we get better, is when we share ideas, when we think together. Gosh, we are so much better when we think together. It's kind of like, I don't know about you, but I really love when I go to a garden or I go to places where I can see lots of different flowers with the diversity and the difference. Gosh, diversity and difference is so beautiful. As much as I love a single flower, those gardens that are varied and unique are really fantastic. If we want to garden together, if we want to work together, if we want to support growth together, we need things, a few things we need lots of things, but here's some things that I focused on today. One is shared understandings. We need to start asking ourselves what flowers are in our garden. What are the unique characteristics of each child? How are they expressing? How are they communicating? How are they trying to already meet their needs? And what can we do to support them in meeting their needs in other ways that are more growth supportive? I think helping, I'm sorry, that pauses me reading your comment, Lee. I tell you, I don't multitask well. Helping families discover how each person in the family is an individual. So important. Like even like think of your family. Again, visuals. See what you've done, Angel? Even to say about your family and think about your family and have every child pick their own flower. And you could put a little visual on your wall and think about how each person in your family is different and why that means that you need different things. And sometimes, when I talk to families or educators, they'll often say it's really hard if I have several children or a classroom of children to say the rules are different for each of you. And because sometimes the rules have to be a little different for different kids. Well, if everybody has a flower, then we can start talking about how every flower needs slightly different things to grow. Every flower needs slightly different considerations. Some flowers need more water. Some flowers need more sun. Some flowers need more heat. Some need different kinds of things in their soil. And it might create space for a conversation and get kids starting to see themselves as unique and distinct, and that's beautiful and fantastic. We don't want all marigolds. I love marigolds. They're my favorite flower. I told you guys that to start with. But I don't only put marigolds in my garden. I like more variety, and I think that that's a fantastic piece. And I think that each flower contributes to the other when we have that diversity. So how do we play with that? And how do we start to understand? Sometimes we don't know what a flower is going to be if we have that seed, and we have to spend the time, back to patience, the comment about patience, to understand the unique needs of our flower and to pay attention. And if our flower isn't growing the way we expect, then sometimes we have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what could we do differently? What do we need to shift in the environment so that we can create growth? Because growth is possible. It may be slow, it may be at the own pace, it may be unique to that individual, but it's possible. What are we doing to create those conditions? Having a growth mindset for yourself and for others creates that climate and that condition for growth to occur. Asking yourself, what am I able to grow? What is harder for me to grow? When do I need to reach out? When don't I need to reach out? Thinking about your first thoughts when you're meeting a child, if it's your child or a child you're working with who's struggling, what are our reactions? And how do we shift that into a growth mindset? Being really honest with ourselves, because there's nothing wrong with that. Saying, gosh, you know what? I just say that is really annoying me. This is driving me crazy. How do I make it stop? Any of us who have never felt that sometime. So then, all right, if I'm frustrated, how do I take on that growth mindset and turn that into a growth goal? How do I think, okay, what do I need to grow? How do I need to shift? Because I need to think about conditions for growth. Sometimes some plants are a little bit more difficult, or there's components that make them harder to grow. I love roses. I love roses. I love growing roses. But any of you who have grown roses know that sometimes they're prickly, and you get in there and you're trimming them or you're taking care of them to help nurture that growth, and they poke and it hurts sometimes and it's pretty uncomfortable. It doesn't change the beauty of the flower. But that flower has learned how to protect itself. That flower has learned that to be safe, it's got to be a little bit prickly. So I learned, all right, when I'm working with the roses, I don't stop working with the roses. And I don't say my roses can't grow. I say, no, I want roses. I love roses. They're beautiful. But I'm sure going to wear good gloves when I'm working with those roses. Because they're gonna prick me. And that's not because these roses are trying to hurt me. It's because that's their natural protective system. So I need to put some gloves on. I got to think about how I put them in a space and place where maybe they're going to be safer. I'm not going to put them right next to a walkway where every time I walk by, I'm going to scrape myself. I'm going to put them somewhere else where they're going to have room and space to grow in the way that makes sense for them. Finally, I often will say what we want to think about when we're working as a team, we're working with a group, is what are our harvest goals? What are we looking for at the end? And so often our goals, as we've talked about so many times today, are really about how do I reduce a behavior? How do I eliminate a problem? Harvest goals suggest that maybe what we should think about is what do we want to see at the end? What is our growth goal? What possibility could we see? And that allows us to say, what expectations do we prioritize? What do we say is most important? Coming back to my son, what was important was that you wore pants, not what kind of pants, what style of pants. I didn't need him to be the best looking kid in the Safeway. That was not my goal. Nor was my goal to really, although I wanted to get out to Safeway, it wasn't saying get rid of the temper tantrums. It was, I want to get to Safeway. I want to see my son get there. I want to see him come shopping with me. So changing our expectations, changing it to prioritize something that is a destination goal or a growth goal. Harvest goals really allow us to focus on what we want to see, what will be achieved. Am I focused on the flower or am I focused on the weeds? Is a rose any less beautiful because of its thorns? Let's change our questions. What outcomes are possible? How deeply rooted is our relationship? That's a question I always like to come back to. And I say sometimes when we're not getting to goals, I have to go back to my relationship piece and say, what can I do to engage differently? Particularly if we're working from a service provider position, not a caregiver position, these are things that are really important to come back to. And how am I creating the conditions for trust, not just with the child, but also with my caregivers? How tall do we want the flower to be? What do we want to see happen? How do we create those? What's possible? Not can we grow, but how can we grow and what might be possible? Let's set those bars higher. No one wakes up an orchid or a marigold. Back to patience, like Angel said earlier. Are my timelines reasonable? Am I taking enough time to give this child the opportunity to grow? Have I really set some mini goals to celebrate? So if I'm using those visuals to think about growth, I don't want to just look for that flower because overnight I'm not going to plant a seed, wake up the next morning and see my marigold or see my orchid. It's going to take a long time. But you know what? I'm going to look at that pot every day. And then at one point, I'm going to see a tiny little glimpse of green coming out. And I'm going to be like, woohoo, it's green. And I'm going to celebrate. I'm going to be excited. I'm going to dance. Next, I'm going to get up and that little green is going to be bigger. And I'm going to celebrate that again. And those little bits and those little signs of growth are exciting and invigorating. How do we build that in to our growth mentality and celebrate those with our kids? So it's not just saying, oh, good job, you didn't do this today. It's good job, look what you did today. Way to go. As you do this, ask yourself hard questions. Ask yourself the hard questions about where your beliefs are and how you're setting expectations. Look at yourself in the mirror a little bit and say, am I being good to myself? Am I adopting the same philosophy with myself? Be curious, ask questions, share your curiosity. How could we do this? How could we make some visuals? How could we shift our thinking? Because we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, as the expression goes. What we're doing is we're saying, let's look at the way we're already doing things and just ask ourselves, are we having enough growth opportunity here? Are we talking about growth, strength in a way that is meaningful? When we talk about strengths, is it the add-on at the end of the sentence that we say because we're supposed to say strength, or are we truly focused on strengths? Because growth occurs out of strength. We don't grow out of an area of difficulty. We grow where we're strength. We grow where we're strong. Those are the things that feel really good. Yeah, causes setting sub goals. Exactly. It doesn't matter. You're right, Lee, how young those kids are. Kids pay attention to this stuff. They love to celebrate. They love to see things, just like the rest of us, right? You know, like those days when you go out and you're walking down the street and somebody says, hey, nice shoes. I'm a shoe girl, by the way. Lee knows this because she's met me, but any of those, whenever I meet any of you in person, just comment me on my shoes and that will be a cause for celebration right there. And you know what? My entire day is better. How many of you have had that where somebody acknowledges something about you and says, I like this, or way to go, or I like the way you said that? Merle earlier said, this is such awesome information. And I had this moment where I'm like, oh, I feel so much better. I'm glad that this is useful. And I felt really good. And it motivated me to keep talking. So thank you, Merle, for doing what for sharing that thought, because it really impacted me. Think about those outcomes. Think about that evidence of growth. It really matters to us. And continue to have these kinds of conversations. Talk about these opportunities. Be creative. Children bloom when they feel proud, don't they? You know, Angel, I think we all do, right? We all kind of get a little flush in our face when we feel good about something or we hear something good. We all bloom. We all become our best. It's, a little sunshine goes a long way, and that really warms our hearts and warms who we are. And that is not just Pollyanna feel good kind of stuff. This is actually really good science now. And the more that we look at brains and we study neural networks and we look at neuroplasticity, increasingly we're understanding how some of these growth conditions are actually conducive to brain growth and brain development. So although we're using plants and flowers as a metaphor today, these concepts apply to the way our brain actually grows and develops and becomes enhanced in terms of its networking. Um, when we feel encouraged, when we feel this praise, when we're growth oriented, we are motivated to persist. When we persist, we will do things over and over again. Practice really does increase the strength of our neural connections, the strength of our brain in persisting and going forward. In a safety of a relationship that we feel is very trustworthy, we're willing to persist and keep going and keep growing. And it does make our brains stronger. It makes us more capable. It makes us more efficient in how we process information. These are powerful components and they really work together very, very well. And so it's very exciting to me to talk about. I was very excited when League provided me this opportunity to come in and talk about all of this today. And I feel like we've covered a little bit of ground together. I don't know if there are any other questions or things that I can go back to or focus on, but it's such a pleasure for me to be able to come in and chat about this. I think that if there is one thing that we can do within any of our initiatives working with children, it's to say, how can we truly embrace the possibility of growth and balance our perspective so that we can start seeing the potential of children, not just the problem of children or the challenge of children or the difficulty, but their true potential. Yes, any specific questions, any thoughts, anything you want me to expand on, I am more than happy to. You see my email on the screen here. I'm happy to answer questions that way as well. Please feel free to reach out. Sometimes it's tough when you're on a webinar. You can't tell where you want to expand or spend time with. So you guys just kind of literally you're going to point and click me right now, but feel free to ask more questions via email. I'm watching you type there, Angel. Oh, there we go. Your example of the pants. Yeah, I'll tell you something, Angel. My son is now 20, and he does wear his pants all the time, and he's actually very concerned with what color they are. That could have something to do with his girlfriend now, but the good news is that he's no longer wearing the fluorescent green pants. He does shake his head a little bit when I tell him that I use him as an example in these conversations that we have. I think one of these days he's afraid he's going to encounter people that are going to say, "Hey, Nathan, nice to see you in pants." Um, Poor kid. But he puts up with me. But I'm glad you found that useful. It is something choice has been something that's really important. As a psychologist, I do a lot of assessment, and I always include kids in some component of my debrief portion of the assessment. So I'll do an assessment in order to gain a really good understanding of a child, their areas of difficulty, their areas of strength, to try to understand what that flower looks like so that we can really set some meaningful expectations that are growth oriented and, really kind of direct ourselves in that way. But sitting in those debriefs, I always say, I don't care about the age of the child. At some point, I want that child to join us for that. And choices, that opportunity for choice is something that I like to build into every single case conference. And I say, we're going to do something like this. And would you like it to be more like this or that, or more of this or less of this? And I ask every child. And then I try to, where possible, even identify in my recommendations what the child contributed and the fact that they wanted to do something a certain way, or they said this, or when we enact this, let's try to keep so-and-so's comment in mind and do it in this way so that their choice is actually reflected in writing and they can see that. So I think for me, angel choice has been probably one of the biggest things that has influenced, well, choice and expectation have really influenced the way I practice and the way I work with teams of support, caregivers, community members, service providers, anybody, is to play with that and to think about what it is to be, because it's got to be meaningful too. It can't just be superficial. So there's got to be something about it. But it's been a lot of fun being creative about that. And I think it looks different for every child and every team. Well, thank you, Natalie. I just read your comment. I don't know if she's still, oh, she's still here. That's very, I'm glad you're enjoying, or you enjoyed the presentation.
Okay, I'm going to wait for AHS to finish typing their questions, and then I'll just wrap things up for a few minutes. But we'll wait till you finish typing there. Well, while we're waiting, I just want to thank everybody for coming. And I know sometimes people need certificates. If you do need a certificate, just click on the hyperlink to my email below and send me the names of who all attended. I If you're kind of a general site, I do need to know who the other people's names are that are attending with you. So please let me know and where to email individual certificates to. This webinar was chosen for two reasons. The first was a long time ago at our Prevention Matters meeting or conference. One of the closing speakers was a woman with a hearing impairment, and I don't know if anybody remembers this, but one of the things she talked about was that her parents really had realistic but very strong expectations for her growth and development and where she could go in life. And with those expectations, she actually was able to go a lot further than anyone had originally expected she would, based on the original kind of medical opinion or diagnosis side of things. So that had really struck me quite strongly. And then recently, as many of you know, I do have a grandchild who has myotonic dystrophy and was born severely disabled. She's now 7. Um, and yeah, there's still tons of things um, that she can't do or hasn't excelled at yet. But having those expectations instead of saying, okay, you'll never walk, having the expectation that one day maybe she will. And now she's actually walking with a walker. Um, Learning sign language, for example, baby sign language, and spending time doing that instead of kind of going on the other side of, oh, she's non-communicative, really helped her to learn how to have a way to communicate with us. So just really not pushing kids to the point where they're going to feel um, so much pressure that they can't perform, but allowing kids to have those opportunities to grow and showing them that you believe in them, that all those little steps, you believe that together you can achieve, really can help children to grow beyond sometimes what those expectations are. It's amazing.
It's so powerful, isn't it, Lee? Yeah. And it is one of those things that we sometimes we worry about it, but I think we've let our worry kind of
Mm-hmm.
overtake the benefit of that expectation. This summer. Gosh, I love that example. Yeah, you did not do it. What went wrong? And instead, it becomes, hang on, let's keep trying. Let's be patient. Let's find out what it means to. And that's really a shifting mindset. Like, what a beautiful opportunity to shift mindset and say, it's not about what went wrong. It's let's just kind of be patient here, take our time. What a beautiful example. Um, yeah, self-regulation is really, I like we said earlier, such a great opportunity to apply growth perspectives. It really is. It's the two
Mhm.
growth mindset really aligns well with regulatory stuff. Yeah. What a lovely example.
I'm
Thank you
really
for
wishing you
sharing
were at
that.
my house when my garden was not growing.
I know. I I definitely have days where it doesn't grow as well, and I have to phone for help and get somebody to help me out. I don't know what to do. I can't seem to make it grow, but you get the right help and right support, and
Hmm.
we can figure it out. We really can. We just got to believe in these kids. It's very powerful.
Oh, just gonna wait for AHS to finish again. It's such a hard thing when
I
you're
think it's watching
expected to
the.
type.
Yes,
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming. I know there's.
absolutely my pleasure. I really.
Sorry, keep going, Jackie.
All right. It's always a little bit hard to know. I just wanted to say I really appreciated the opportunity to have this conversation, and I thank you so much, Lee, for your interest and passion for this area of work. I think that it's something we need to keep talking about and get even increasingly applied about it. And those of you who, if you want to contact me, there's a couple of books I could suggest as well. There's one that's been done, and it's actually for kids as they get into school ages. Um, it's called Mindsets in the Classroom. While you're wrapping up, maybe what I could do is just type it into the comment box there, Lee. And it's just kind of a resource that some of you might find really valuable. And Angel was talking about visual stuff that may provide just some resources and tools that you could use and maybe bring to your children's educators to help communicate that as well. Please
Okay.
feel free to
Thank you,
contact me with any
Jackie.
questions.
And thank you to everyone who attended. I know there was a bit of a time glitch. So I'm so glad you were able to come on board. If you have anybody that you know that wasn't able to come with that difference in time, just tell them to write me, and I'll give them a link to the presentation. I'll only keep it online for a month though, so I would need them to tell me that sooner rather than later. And please check out what the next webinars will be. It's on our website, www.skprevention.ca. So you can look up, there is one a month that is booked until the end of March, and they will continue. We do them once a month. So please also let me know, send me an email if you have any topics that you want to make sure is covered. And definitely if you have a speaker, you can also cover that topic, and you think would be great for the group. Let me know. If not, then I can try to search around for people as well. So thank you very much. With the fellowship that I'm doing with 0 to 3, I will be in contact a lot more with the network, trying to get more mobilization and movement around various topics. So I'll be speaking to you all later.